Boldwood presents Murder at the Abbey, written by Francis Evesham and read by Charlotte Strevens. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Picnic. Libby Forest groaned as she hitched her backpack higher. "Are we nearly there yet? I'm roasting." Max Ramshaw threw a stick for Shipley the Springer Spaniel to fetch.
"Almost, and these packs weigh a ton. I blame you, of course. They're full of your food."
Libby snorted. "Nonsense! It's all the beer you brought. My creations are as light as a feather. At least, that's what you said before I married you." Shipley returned, somehow looking pleased with himself, despite the stick in his mouth. "He doesn't seem to feel the heat at all, does he?" Libby said, pulling a treat from a pocket. Shipley dropped the stick and crunched the chicken-flavoured treat. "I'm glad we left Bear at home," Libby went on. "It would be far too hot for him today, and his rheumatic joints would suffer. And," she spoke in mock severity, "please don't offer a scientific description of how a Carpathian sheepdog's thick fur wicks away sweat and stops him from overheating."
"Yes, dear,"
Max said meekly.
"Married 6 months and you're bullying me already."
He stopped walking.
"Come over here. There's a nice patch of shade under this tree."
6 months already," Libby repeated, allowing him to fold her in his arms. She broke into tuneless song. "And it don't seem a day too long." Max chuckled.
"I was terrified something would go wrong at the wedding, that you'd be kidnapped, or my ex-wife would turn up with yet another toy boy. But it was perfect, wasn't it?"
"Everything I'd dreamed about. You, me, the children and both dogs. Although I think Fuzzy felt left out."
"Cats don't like weddings."
A voice behind them interrupted.
"Mrs. F, get a room, please."
Mandy, Libby's tenant in Hope Cottage, had caught up.
"Nothing to see here,"
Max said. Libby linked her arm in Max's as they walked on. "You know, Mandy, you could call me Libby."
Max mumbled, "If you'd agreed to take my name, she could call you Mrs. R instead."
"I'm much too old to change my name," Libby pronounced, as though they hadn't enjoyed this argument 100 times. "And we'd also have to change the name of our private investigation business to Ramshaw and Ramshaw, which would just be silly. Not to mention altering the labels for Mrs. Forest's chocolates."
"Which is a successful brand,"
Mandy pointed out. Libby asked, "Aren't you hot?" Despite the unusual heat of the last few June days, Mandy wore a black maxi dress under a red lace shawl.
"Cotton and lace, that's the answer."
Mandy, Libby's talented and capable assistant, was also a determined goth, buying most of her clothes at vintage shops in Bristol and Bath, and wearing an ever-changing supply of metal face adornments. Today's addition was a third silver ring through her right eyebrow.
"And here's my secret weapon."
With a flourish, she pulled out a black lace fan from one of the pockets of the voluminous dress and waved it in front of her face, her armful of chainmail bracelets clinking musically.
"Anyway, we've arrived."
They rounded a clump of trees, and Cleeve Abbey, the 12th century Cistercian abbey, this year's destination for the Exham-on-Sea History Society's picnic, rose before them, semi-ruined but still exuding an air of gentle rural calm. With relief, they chose a spot in the shade of the majestic trees within the abbey walls and dropped their backpacks on the grass. Libby spread a checked cloth on the grass, and Max peeped into a series of sealed containers stuffed with tiny goat's cheese and onion phyllo tartlets, smoked salmon and beetroot baguettes, a selection of salads, and individual jars of strawberry cheesecake. "No chocolate today, I'm afraid, not in this heat," Libby said. Soon the other members of the society arrived. Some had left cars across the lane, while others had followed the example of Libby, Max and Mandy, and taken the steam train to nearby Washford station, walking the last half-mile to the Abbey. They bought guidebooks from the shop and wandered happily through the well-preserved ruins, exclaiming at the preservation of the indoors areas, soaking up the atmosphere of peace and tranquillity in the cloister, and chatting with a couple of knowledgeable volunteers. An hour later, Libby lay supine with her head in Max's lap, her stomach comfortably full, enjoying the warmth of the dappled sunlight on her face. Nearby, a cow lowed, contented. Rooks cawed from the tops of the trees. Peering through her sunglasses, Libby spotted a skylark rising, singing its heart out until it was a tiny dot in the perfect azure sky. "You know," she murmured, "that Caribbean island was a great place for our honeymoon, and sunshine in January was a wonderful treat, but there's nothing to beat a beautiful summer day in Somerset." She sat up. "In fact, that must be why it's called Somerset. I hadn't thought of that before." Quentin Dobson, folded like a spider into a camping chair nearby, turned and smiled. Elderly but still spry, the curator of the museum at nearby Watchet could never resist an opportunity to pass on what he called fun facts from his remarkable fund of historical knowledge.
"As you would expect," he began, settling his wire-rimmed spectacles more comfortably over his ears. "Somerset originally referred to people who live near Somerton, with Somerton meaning a summer settlement. I believe it was the Celts, looking across from Wales, who originally named it in honour of the green fields they could see across the Bristol Channel. But I'm afraid I can't remember the attribution just now, so perhaps it would be best not to quote me."
Max nudged Libby.
"No danger of that,"
he whispered, as Jemima Bakewell, a retired, unmarried schoolteacher with a passion for history, offered an alternative theory. Something about mispronunciation. Libby really didn't care. It was far too hot to worry. She watched as Max listened to the earnest conversation with a puzzled frown. He maintained a love-hate relationship with the History Society, for he lacked the members' enthusiasm for gossip. Libby had shamelessly dangled a chance to drink his favourite Hook Norton beer in the sun as a bribe to get him to today's picnic. The society members finished eating, and Dr. Archie Phillips, the ageing librarian at Wells Cathedral, rose and stretched. "Time for a little exercise," he said. "Jemima, come for a stroll?" He'd driven Jemima Bakewell to the picnic himself, claiming the right to set her chair close to his. He'd seemed none too pleased when Quentin joined them. Jemima stood awkwardly, leaning on the flimsy arm of her chair. It tipped sideways, and only Archie's supporting arm saved her from a fall.
"Oops," she blushed. "I'm always falling over. It's a good thing no one expects me to wear stilettos like the young folks. I'd be on the floor all the time."
Giggling like a teenager after her 2 glasses of white wine, she set off towards the river, Archie at her side. Mandy slipped a slice of ham to Shipley.
"I think it's adorable," she said, "at their age." "What do you mean by that, young lady?"
Quentin, older than either Jemima or Archie, had overheard.
"Sorry,"
Mandy grinned, not at all apologetic.
"I just think it's lovely when older people get together, you know, for companionship or whatever."
Quentin's face was beetroot red.
"Good gracious me! You young people think life ends at 50. Ridiculous!"
Snorting like a horse, he left his chair and followed Jemima and Archie. Libby wagged a finger at Mandy. "We'll throw you out of the society if you're cheeky," she said.
"I don't mean you two," Mandy said. "You're quite sprightly, really. But Jemima must be, like, over 70, and Quentin's even older. I mean, can they even—"
A cry from the river saved her from digging a bigger hole for herself.
"Oh, no. What's Jemima done now?"
sighed Libby's friend, Angela Miles.
"Do you think we should find out?"
She rose gracefully from a velvet cushion. Trust Angela, Libby thought fondly, to somehow contrive to look elegant even at a picnic. Mandy chuckled.
Maybe those two are fighting over her.
Just then, Archie returned, purple from running, beckoning frantically.
Come here, everyone. You'll never believe what we've found.
Chapter 2. The Find. Galvanised, the picnickers ran towards the river, Shipley bounding by Libby's side, straining at the leash. The water gurgled happily over stones, beside the lane and just outside the remains of the abbey walls. Jemima stood in the river, the water reaching halfway up her calves, and tugged at something under the waterline. "What is it?" Libby cried.
You'll never believe it. I saw it sticking out of the bank.
Quentin hovered at the edge of the water.
I told you not to go in the water. You'll catch your death.
Nonsense. It's refreshing.
Jemima gave another tug. Whatever she was holding came away from the mud of the bank with a squelch, and she toppled backwards into the river, waving a pale object above her head.
Got it!
She shouted. Archie tried to help her out of the water, but she brushed him away.
Stop fussing and look what I've found.
In her right hand, one end clogged with mud, the other washed clean by the water, she held a long, pale bone.
Oh, good Lord, Angela breathed. Please tell me it's an animal.
The society members jostled each other, keen to get a closer look. Quentin took the bone from Jemima's hand.
If I'm not mistaken, he intoned solemnly, this is a human thigh bone.
Max hovered on the edge of the river, straining to get a better look.
I can't see any more.
A shout interrupted him.
Oi, you lot! What are you up to? You can't fish in this river, not without a permit, you know.
Libby turned, and her stomach lurched. She recognised the man appearing from a clump of trees between the river and the abbey. Her throat tight, she gasped,
Max, it's Wendlebury. Chesterton Wendlebury.
She grabbed Max's hand, squeezing it.
He's back.
Wendlebury, over 6 feet tall and as broad as a weightlifter, shook a carved walking stick at the picnickers as he advanced, red-faced and angry. His hair was thinner than last time Libby had seen him in Taunton Crown Court, where he'd been sentenced for his very minor role as a bumbling board member of a fraudulent organisation. Pritchard's, in a case that had rocked Exham-on-Sea to its foundations.
Well, if it isn't Mrs. Forest! Good afternoon to you, dear lady, Wendlebury boomed. And is this, by any chance, one of the Exham societies you all love so much, enjoying a day out? And what on earth have you got there?
Libby swallowed, but before she could speak, Max replied,
Wendlebury, fancy meeting you here. Good to see you out and about again.
Quentin's eyes narrowed.
We're not fishing, and in any case, the river doesn't belong to you, so we'd be grateful if you'd leave us to our business.
Archie nodded in agreement and turned to Jemima.
Besides, we must call the authorities and find out whether or not this bone is human.
Jemima waded carefully out of the river, clutching Archie's arm for support, as Quentin laid the trophy reverently on the grass. Wendlebury's arrival had silenced the members of the society, but now their voices rose in a babble of excited comment. Under cover of the chatter, Libby whispered in Max's ear, I know it's silly, but seeing Wendlebury again gives me the shivers. I knew he was coming out of prison, but to meet him brings it all back. Chesterton Wendlebury's company had been involved in the death of Libby's first husband a few years ago, shortly before she moved to Exham-on-Sea. Though Trevor had been an overbearing and controlling man, and had played a part in the money-laundering scam, he hadn't deserved to die.
No need to worry,
Max said, giving her shoulder a reassuring squeeze.
Wendlebury was more a fool than a criminal, weak rather than bad, despite his bluster.
Just so long as history doesn't repeat itself, Libby muttered. They turned their backs on Wendlebury and peered at the long, strong bone.
Are there any more in there?
Angela asked. Max turned to Mandy.
Could you run up to reception? They'll call the police and contact experts if it looks like a human bone.
Which it certainly does,
Libby put in. I'm going to see if there are any more in the river, Jemima interrupted. She shook off Archie's arm and stepped back into the water. It's just as well it's summer. Libby, distracted by a series of shudders that had run down her back at the sight of Chesterton-Wendlebury, had dropped Shipley's lead. Before she could stop him, he leapt into the water and nosed along the bank. There, said Jemima, he's come to help. A grand fellow, aren't you? Now, what can we find? Libby shared a despairing look with Max as Shipley, suddenly rigid and pointing to show he'd found something interesting, gave a short, sharp bark. There's more! Jemima was triumphant. She scraped away more mud as the others gathered round. Slowly, under her fingers, a smooth, rounded bone appeared. Libby recognised it. Wait, she called. I don't think we should disturb it. You can see, it's... Max put his arm around her shoulders. It's a human skull. Silence fell. Archie's voice sounded strained. It may not be human, and faded into silence. The watchers exchanged glances, quite certain they were looking at the remains of a person. Mandy returned with the guide. The police are on their way, she said. They sound thrilled. I guess they haven't had much excitement since that last murder in the Avon Gorge. The elation of the find had ebbed away, and, as if on cue, clouds began to gather in the sky. Jemima, back on dry land once more, shivered.
It's going to rain, Quentin said. We should find shelter. The police could take hours to get here.
Well, I'm going nowhere, Jemima said. We can stay dry in the Abbey, in the refectory or the dormitory.
Finally, after discussion, Libby, Max and the guide agreed to stay down by the river with the bones, while the others, refusing to leave until they'd squeezed every drop of interest out of the day, wandered back to the Abbey to finish eating and take shelter from the approaching weather. Archie insisted on leading Jemima to his car to keep her warm. Mandy hissed at Libby, He'll be telling her to take her off her dress and wrapping her in a blanket. Libby gestured towards Quentin. Not if he has anything to do with it. Do you think they'll fight? Mandy's eyes gleamed. I think there's been quite enough excitement for one day, Libby said firmly. To her relief, Chesterton-Wendlebury had left the scene. Not in a hurry to meet up with the boys in blue again, Libby guessed. I wonder how it was that Wendlebury appeared just then. Was he following us? She asked Max. He shrugged. I've no idea. I suppose he's just out for a day in the countryside. Once the police arrive, we should get on home. Shipley needs a bath. He's covered in mud. Chapter 3. Monks. Next morning, Libby's phone rang even before she was dressed. A young voice said, Detective Constable Gemma Humberstone here. Detective Chief Inspector Morrison suggests that, as you were present at Cleeve Abbey yesterday when those bones were found, perhaps you'd like to come and meet with the biological anthropologist today?
Come again, Gemma? Libby yawned. It's far too early for long words.
As a partner in Ramshaw and Forest, private investigators, she'd worked closely with Gemma on other murder inquiries. Despite the young constable's initial reluctance to work with an amateur investigator, the two women had learned to like and trust each other. She's a bone expert, Gemma explained. She works at Bristol University, and she's going to the Abbey to excavate the bones from the Washford River. We sent a photo, and she agrees they're likely to be human, in which case they have to be treated with great care, examined and then reburied, even if they're ancient bones. We're hoping she'll know how old they are, although she says it will take a while, and we're not to expect a quick result. We'll be there. Libby couldn't wait. Since the day she found a body under the 9-legged lighthouse on Exham-on-Sea beach, she'd discovered a talent for sleuthing. A frisson of excitement slid down her spine. Was this going to be another twisty, intricate investigation into murder, or was there a prosaic explanation? Gemma told her not to bring the entire History Society,
but agreed Jemima, Quentin and Archie were welcome, as they'd found the bones. Max and Libby, she pointed out, were invited because DCI Morrison paid a tiny retainer fee to them as Ramshaw and Forest, private investigators, to help in occasional cases. "Which gives Morrison priority access to us," Max pointed out, grimacing at himself in his shaving mirror as Libby recounted the phone conversation. She laughed. "Sounds grand, though, doesn't it? Makes us sound like proper private investigators. Not that the pet owners who employ us privately to find their cats and dogs care about that." "Well, unless we go down the road of spying on cheating husbands and wives, pet owners and the police are our major client groups. Your baking and chocolates are far more profitable than the PI work, of course." He paused, turned, and plonked a foamy kiss on Libby's cheeks. "And far tastier, if a little decadent." He patted his paunch. She wiped away his shaving foam. "I bought you a top-of-the-range electric razor, but you never use it," she complained. "No, I like a proper shave from a decent blade. Feel that." He proffered his chin for Libby to stroke. "See what I mean? Smooth as a baby's bottom." Libby sat on their bed, watching as he finished shaving. Sometimes she could hardly believe they'd only been married for 6 months. It felt as though they'd been together forever, they fitted so well. She even enjoyed their arguments. There were plenty of those. A few days ago they'd argued for 20 minutes over the best way to load the dishwasher. Both forthright souls, they'd each expected to be living out the second half of their lives as singletons, and as a result, as she admitted to Max, they were set in their ways. "But at least we enjoy making up afterwards." For the 1,000th time, Libby gave thanks for her decision to move to Exham-on-Sea when her first husband died. She shivered. She could be living in London, alone and lonely, if she hadn't decided she needed a change of direction. She still had friends there, kept in touch with them and visited occasionally. But they'd known her as half a couple when she was married to Trevor. She'd been determined to brush the dust of London off her feet and move to the calm of England's West Country when Trevor died. Not that life had stayed calm. The last few years had been a whirl of excitement, culminating in her wedding to Max last Christmas. There was something about this part of the world. Exham-on-Sea was a mix of people. Many had grown up there and never left, while others had come on holiday, loved the fresh sea air and miles of sand, and returned later to live there. Even Libby's 2 children, who tried at first to persuade her against the move, had gradually joined her. Robert, her son, lived nearby with his wife Sarah, who was pregnant, very pregnant, with their first child. To Libby's delight, her wayward daughter Allie was now in Exham too, albeit temporarily, before returning to Brazil with her boyfriend to train as a doctor. "Well," Max said, now fully dressed, "the sun's shining, so get some of your oldest clothes on in case we end up scrambling about in the river. Judging from what we could see of that bone, at least we aren't looking at a recent death." Funny, that. Libby paused, one arm in a trusty old mud-coloured linen T-shirt. You'd think one death was as bad as another. But if this bone's as old as we think, it's not so sad, somehow. It's more exciting than upsetting, although seeing the skull gave me a jolt. I wonder what stories the bones will tell. The old grandfather clock in Max's study clanged 9 times. "Let's get going," Libby said. "I've got a busy day, and I don't want to neglect baking too much. After all, that's how I made my living when I arrived in Somerset. I promised to call into Hope Cottage this afternoon to work on some new recipes with Mandy. She does most of the baking in the cafe's kitchen, but I like to work with her on new products, and Angela's begging for more." Max said, "Angela's turned out to be quite a stern taskmaster since she opened the new cafe." "She's in her element," Libby agreed. "The Crusts and Crumbs cafe gets busier every day, and now the summer season's in full swing, the tills ring constantly." She retrieved a pair of sturdy boots from the wardrobe. "Metaphorically, I mean. Most people just tap credit cards, which is efficient but far less cheery." Max ran downstairs, collected Bear and Shipley, and loaded them into his car. Fuzzy, Libby's fat and lazy marmalade cat, stalked past the two dogs with her usual supercilious air, and made her way to the sunniest spot in Max's study, where she stretched out, sighed deeply as though pleased to have the house to herself, and went to sleep. Chapter 4. Bones. The section of Washford River that ran past the Abbey was cordoned off with police tape, in case it should turn out to be what DC Gemma Humberstone called a forensic case of interest to the police. Libby supposed that meant an unexplained and possibly recent death. When she arrived, a small group of young people, probably students from Bristol University, were already squatting at the water's edge, holding trowels. As well as observers from the English Heritage Trust, the organisation caring for the Abbey, a group of sightseers had gathered nearby, alerted by Somerset Live online news. In addition, the 3 History Society members were easy to spot, for they were holding forth to a group of ramblers who'd come across the site on their way around the coast path from Minehead to Bridgewater. Jemima, eyes gleaming with the joy of a lifelong teacher, was explaining the history of the area to the newcomers. She seemed to have covered several centuries before Libby's arrival, from the Bronze Age to the Reformation and the dissolution of the monasteries. Some of the ramblers' eyes had glazed over. Others leaned around Jemima's considerable bulk, trying to see what the handful of workers inside the police cordon were doing. Max and Libby approached the dig, both dogs held firmly on leads, and Libby's heart sank. "Oh, no," she murmured. "P.C. Ian Smith." Max squeezed her hand. "I'd have known he'd be here. He's dead wood in DCI Morrison's team and kept away from anything sensitive. Morrison would see an archaeological dig as a safe place where Smith can't cause trouble." Spotting them approaching, P.C. Smith raised the tape to let them through. "Can't imagine you'll have much to say about this case," he sneered at Libby. "Seems to be ancient history, though, mind you." His gaze travelled insultingly over her face. Max took a long step and got between Smith and Libby. "Got something to say, Smith?" he asked. Smith shrugged. "Just trying to be friendly." He gave a false smile, his tiny eyes almost disappearing in a pudgy face. DC Gemma Humberstone raised her eyebrows at Libby. "Sorry about Ian," she said. "Apparently, he did some course on anthropology once, so the boss thought he might be useful." Smith held up an officious hand. "No dogs allowed." "Let me look after them for you." Archie Phillips took the leads. He'd learned to love Bear after a disastrous first meeting, when Bear had knocked a pile of his books down a flight of stairs. The dogs, as interested as the humans in this new activity in the river, sat obediently by Archie's feet. Jemima broke off her lecture to make a fuss of them. Quentin Dobson, sitting on the bank, peering at the police activity, frowned.
"What's that?"
he said, as one of the students waved his trowel in the air. Libby hovered beside Gemma, wishing she was allowed in the river along with the student. A youth, in his early 20s, his straggly red hair escaping from a baseball cap, pointed to the rounded ends of 2 long bones, newly revealed in the mud at the side of the river. He grinned at Libby's squeak of excitement, while a dark-haired woman wearing massive, thick-soled boots waded into the water. Between them, the 2 researchers delicately scraped at the mud until they could retrieve both of the bones, resting them in a cardboard box. The woman stood up and stretched. "Well done, Rory," she said, touching one of the bones lightly with long fingers. "These are definitely human remains," she added. "Most likely rib bones, but we need to take them back to the labs to date them." She looked at Libby and Max as though suddenly noticing them. "And you are?" Libby, oddly intimidated by this young but self-possessed professional woman, held out her hand. "Libby Forest." The woman raised an eyebrow, wiped her hand on the back of her jeans, and took Libby's hand in a firm grip. The handshake made Libby's bones crunch a little. Libby said, "And this is Max Ramshaw." The younger woman narrowed her eyes, though summing up Max. "Charlie," she said. "Charlie Foxtrot." The professional mask slipped a little, and a sudden smile lit her face. Max chuckled. "Really?" "My first name's Anne, actually," she said. "But I've been Charlie all my life. My school friends thought it funny and it stuck." Gemma said, "Actually, this is Professor Foxtrot. She's been at the university for a year now." Charlie waved a hand as though shrugging off her title, nodded briskly and turned back to the red-haired young man, obviously her student, asking him questions about the bones. His reply, studied with superior and inferior articulating regions and connecting costo-vertebral joints, meant almost nothing to Libby. Charlie's replies were equally technical, so Libby stepped across to Jemima. The elderly teacher's face glowed with the excitement of the find.
"I can't believe that after all these years I've found something so exciting. I can't wait to find out how old these remains are."
Charlie had overheard and turned around. "Well done. It's quite a discovery. We'll need a few days, but my students will be thrilled to help find out everything we can." Max said, "How much can you tell from these bones?" Charlie took a moment to think, hunched, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jeans. "Well, the skull will help a lot. Rory?" The student had gone back to his colleagues, but she beckoned him over. "Rory, can you tell what we think so far?" With delicate, careful movements, Rory picked up the box that held the skull. The relic lay sideways, neatly packed in cotton waste. "It's a man," he said. "You see? The shape of the forehead and the big jaw." Libby fingered her own jaw, checking for size. The one in the box was definitely bigger. "I see what you mean." "We don't have the pelvis, but we're pretty sure," the student said. He grinned at Libby. "The teeth are worn, which suggests the man was roughly middle-aged, but that's a guess." "How long has he been here?" Max asked. "We need to do some carbon dating, using accelerator mass spectrometry, AMS for short." Libby tried to look intelligent. "Does that mean you'll have to send the bones away?" Rory's grin widened. "It just so happens we have a spectrometer at the university, so we could do it ourselves, although it'll take a few days. If it turns out that the bones are old, maybe even hundreds of years old, it would mean the body hasn't been in the water all that time. The skeleton would have disintegrated." He jiggled from one leg to the other, as excited as Libby. She feared he might drop the box in his excitement. Charlie explained, "Either someone dug him up recently and dumped him in the river, or, more likely, he was washed away from his original resting place. We had 2 or 3 days of heavy rain a week or so ago. That would explain why there are only a few bones. Most of them must have gone down the river, out to the Bristol Channel." Max was squinting at the skull. "What's that?" He pointed to the back of the skull, where there was a small hole through the bone. "It looks as though someone hit our gentleman over the head." Libby, fascinated, leaned past Max to better see the hole in the skull. "Could that be deliberate?" she asked. "Possibly," Rory said. He shot a glance at Libby, his eyes shining. "But not necessarily. We can't jump to conclusions, although I can't see any sign of healing, which would mean that this might just possibly have been inflicted at the time of death. But that doesn't mean it's the cause of death." Charlie took the box from him. "Quite right, Rory. We need to research this properly." She flashed her sudden smile at Max. "Gemma here tells me you two are the local experts on solving Somerset murders." She turned back to the riverbank. "You never know. We may have a genuine murder mystery for you. We'll all have to be patient. We get used to that in this business." Just then an angry voice shattered the excitement of the dig. For a second, Libby thought it was Chesterton Wendlebury again, and her stomach clenched. She swung round, determined not to let him intimidate her,
only to find the voice belonged instead to a small, sharp-faced man wearing heavy boots and waving a hefty walking stick. He wore a substantial anorak, although the sun was already beating down, and the BBC weather forecaster had talked excitedly about 4 more sunny days before the current mini heatwave breaks. A map poked out from one pocket of the stranger's anorak. A thin woman trailed in his wake, frowning and biting her lips. Walkers. And the man meant business. "You interfering students!" he shouted. "Get out of our way! This part of the country is free for us to walk in, and I'm not letting a bunch of lazy kids stop me going where I'm entitled." The man had clearly mistaken Charlie for a student, and in his fury failed to notice the police tape. Charlie turned. "I beg your pardon," she said, steel barely concealed beneath the words. "If you try to disturb these bones," she went on, "you'll be in trouble. This is an official burial ground. I'm afraid you'll have to walk somewhere else." She waved a hand that encompassed miles of countryside. "There's plenty of space for everyone." "Why, you jumped up—" The man stopped talking as Gemma held out her police badge. "Detective Constable Humberstone," she said sweetly, "and this is a police scene." She pointed at the bright yellow tape. "I advise you to leave quietly without disturbing the peace any further." The newcomer jerked his stick at Gemma, then seemed to think better of it, and turned away. "Little Hitlers, the lot of you," he grunted, "and you women are the worst of all." His wife, a small mousy woman, tugged at his arm. "Leave it alone, Tom, please." Chapter 5. Crusts and Crumbs Cafe. Libby arrived at the Crusts and Crumbs Cafe at 9:30 the next morning, her head full of plans for new recipes. As the Innovation and Development Consultant, she was responsible for new cake and chocolate recipes, and since Angela now employed more staff than had been possible in the bakery, the cafe's precursor no longer had to arrive early to bake the first batches of bread. She parked her orange Jeep, Max's wedding present to her, just outside the kitchen. A shiver ran down her spine as she locked the car and walked the few steps to the cafe door. She'd been kidnapped from that same kitchen just before her wedding, and the familiar mixed feelings of terror, anger, and helplessness hit her anew every time she entered the premises. She squared her shoulders and strode inside, determined to shake off the memory of the terrifying events that took place during her most recent murder inquiry into the death of a man found in the Avon Gorge. Once in the warmth and bustle of the busy kitchen, she relaxed as she breathed in the smells, warm bread, coffee, and spices. Mandy turned. "Hi!" A white cap covered her black hair, which she'd pulled into a ponytail. She'd removed the rings, hoops, bars, and studs from her nose, lips, and ears, and an apron covered her dark crimson dress. Only a slash of bright purple lipstick marked her out as a goth, as she poured cake mixture into a series of tins. Libby sniffed the air again and pulled on gloves. "Ginger and lemon?" "Right, as always. One of your best recipes, I think." To Mandy's right, Annabel Pearson balanced trays of rolls on both arms, carrying them through to the cafe. Angela Miles, Libby's friend and the manager of the cafe, popped her head through the door. "I thought I heard your voice," she said. "I'm glad you're here. Everyone in Exham seems to have just popped in first thing this morning, hoping to find out more about the bones at the Abbey. Why don't you come through and serve, and put a few folk out of their misery?" Libby hesitated. "I was planning to spend all day on chocolates. I wanted to try a new filling, peanut butter and strawberry." Angela made a face. "Are you sure? I can't quite—" Libby relented. "Oh, maybe it can wait. I do believe you're as keen to hear all the details as everyone else." "Naturally," Angela said. "This place thrives on gossip. Come through, and you'll see. You're the boss." Heads turned as Libby entered,
and the hum of voices paused momentarily before starting up again more loudly. Angela was right. The cafe was already heaving with customers. Every plate groaned with chocolate cake, Victoria sponge, or Black Forest gatto, and a line of customers chatted like sparrows as they queued for sandwiches to take onto the beach. Libby served sausage rolls and cheese baps to hungry workers from the half-dozen estate agents on the high street and fielded their questions. "Now do tell, Mrs. Forest," said Peter, one of the young men working in the local estate agency, taking possession of a tuna sandwich and a slice of cake. His waistline seemed to grow by inches every year. "Mrs. Miles told us about finding the bones, but I bet you have all the gory details, seeing as you're in the pocket of the police." There was an edge to his voice. "I don't know much," Libby said, equably, ignoring the jibe.